Here we are in Phenomenology for part two, making it go. The question is, when we see acts of tabletop role playing occur, the question is, what is happening? What are people doing with what they imagine such that it goes? Part of that going is fictional time. A big part of that going is consequence. When things happen that are now taken as given and really affect what can occur next. And yet a third is revelation, information about what is happening, information about the situation in which the characters may find themselves, or about characters, or any number of things like that. All of these things take on really new relationships with the blending of author and audience that I spoke about in part one. One of the phenomena that must be handled, I think, out of the gate before we talk about anything else is that at the level of the real people speaking, it's not cacophony. We don't have a completely egalitarian setup of who can say what about what. That's not to say that there's a non-egalitarian relationship among one another. I'm thinking very much in terms of a group of people playing music with different instruments. And even if they had exactly the same instruments, let's say guitars and their voices, they would give and take and trade off about who gets to do what or is trusted to be doing what at any given time. So whatever the quality is that we're talking about at the tabletop experience, we are talking about that perhaps presentation of you get to do it this way, you get to talk about this, I get to talk about that, that however flexible it may be, or conversely, however fixed it may be, is extraordinarily functional for that group in the operations of how we make this thing go. I think there are four categories of content that this credibility or responsibility or even just some particular dedicated attention on the part of everyone else for that moment is concerned. What are the four topics? One of them is perhaps a subset of that revelation category. In fiction, we would always refer to it as backstory, things that have occurred prior to the time of the currently engaged fiction. Now, in this blended author audience, that becomes a little blurry because it's not just one moment of fiction with which we are engaged. At the authorial level, we're engaged with backstory at the same time all the time. The point is that right now we're bringing it into the spoken, attended to, and potentially consequential aspects of play at this moment. So easy enough. If the situation involves the dead guy on the carpet and we're all standing around with our teacups, the question is, who done it? Well, this is clearly a matter of backstory. The done it is established. The question is, before this moment of discovery of the done it, who did it? So that's backstory. Another topic I've already mentioned. It's the situation of the moment, and especially beginning the situation, the sub-situation of the moment, the current immediate location of characters, the current immediate state of knowledge, the current immediate condition of everybody, positioning in space, any number of things like that by which we are managing to imagine together. Who establishes that? How is it said? So that's two. Backstory, immediate situation, one might even say scene in a very soft non constrained way. And a third one is really only going to be seen once play is underway within this immediate location. And it is somewhat the opposite of the backstory. It is outcomes. When things happen and other individuals in the fiction react, or the circumstances of the fiction react, what happens and how is that established into place so that we all are on board with it. If somebody's leg is broken in the fiction, how is it established that that is well and truly the case? Or established not to be, for example, so bad, or anything of that kind. That general concept includes within it most of what we think of in traditional role playing as resolution mechanisms, which we can get to later. So then we also, fourth, have a somewhat interesting category. You might think it's unnecessary. It is the spoken quality of any of these things. The moment of establishing, yes, this is how it happens. Think of it not as narrative or anything abstract like that, but the raw physicality of narration. What's kind of interesting in the tabletop context is that these particular moments of narration, and I emphasize that because we're not speaking all at once, but are instead speaking in a fashion where others are attending to it, there come points of narration in which certain things are established. Say the outcome I spoke of, or yes, we're here aspect of the situational establishment, or the revelation, the revealing of some element of backstory. There comes a point when the way it is spoken and the way that it's picked up is taken. It's no longer, oh, could it have been the butler who did it? When whatever occurs in terms of these outcomes that establish that the butler did in fact do it, there is a way it is said, there is a way it is picked up that actually can introduce content uniquely of its own sometimes. And that's why I give this its own category, the narration. So with those four things in mind, as I have tried to imply so far, they are unequally distributed. The interesting question is, how flexibly are they distributed and how widely? Flexibly means that perhaps the distribution of the way we talk about these things changes moment to moment or in designated ways, perhaps very loosely as we go around together. Perhaps it looks as though everything's kind of egalitarian because the way we talk about this seems to jump around. Well, here I was providing stuff about the backstory, and then a few minutes later, you were providing information about the backstory. That's fine. What I'm interested in is that in a given moment of play, it tends not to be utterly simultaneous between those two people, that they are fully according each other full responsibility for doing that. Instead, it tends to be this and then that. So we have that situation, the flexibility, with its extreme end, which is to say that these particular responsibilities or credibilities or any number of other words for it, they could be locked down. One person, for the way we're playing this time, they came up with a backstory. Either they did a while ago before we started to play, or they're doing it right now in an improvised fashion. I don't care, but it is this person who is the backstory person. Everybody else generates that in play by attending to them for backstory. It is understood in that group in playing that particular game that they do in fact rely on that person for backstory. Anything they say about backstory is either speculative, suggestive, adds a little tension about the uncertainty, and that's actually very powerful. So locking down some of these can be very effective Flexibility in some of these can be very effective. All of that becomes a matter of technique in a specific instance of play, not at the level of what are these kinds of credibilities or whatever in the first place. The interplay among them in practice during the course of the activity is the first thing to understand about a given instance of play. How is it being done? Who is talking about what in a fashion that lets everybody know, okay, that's the way for that particular topic. Now, within the context of that purely dialogue and attention style interaction, let's take a look at the activities among the group that are absolutely necessary. We can't do this unless we're oriented regarding what's going on to some degree. We can't do this unless the way we handle the moving forward of fictional time is organized in some way. And we also need to have some really good grasp on how, for any given mechanism of play, is instigated. Most of the role playing that we're familiar with, we pick up our dice. When is that done? Who says roll as opposed to somebody saying I roll? All these kinds of things are organized for a given group of play, perhaps in a way that nobody is really processing, or it's just, as far as they're concerned, the way it's done or the way we do it. The degree of orientation and organization and instigation that goes on is highly characteristic, highly distinctive, and very compelling when you actually put your eye on it. So one of the most common terms that we run into is the concept of the game master, which often indicates a concentration of that credibility that I was talking about earlier, and also perhaps a degree of authority over that orientation and organization and instigation. But I like to break it out into a bunch of different tasks instead. That instead of, again, getting a little bit hyper-focused on the way it's been done or the way it was done in the early days of the hobby or the way that it is most commonly done or something like that, is a bit distracting. Leave it at that the way these things are distributed is very open, but in a given instance of play is very fixed. Let's go ahead and live with that and move on and say, what is it that whoever, this person or several of us, what is it that must be done? Other media help in this case. I don't know how one talks about fiction without talking about scenes. Again, soft scenes. The idea that instead of saying, okay, scene, in this scene, there will be this, in a kind of a cinematic sense, let's talk more about it in a softer sense, that fiction occurs in locations, imagined locations, with imagined entities that move about in them or are acted upon and for which there's consequence. That can shift. We might be focusing on a different character, or we might be focusing on now a different location with perhaps a change in time. Those things shift in the course of fiction. And that's all I'm referring to as scenes. No matter what, in every single instance of tabletop that I've seen, scenes occur and they change. And they don't do so because somehow the weather in the room changes. They do so because of what the people are saying. So that's one of the kind of tasks that occurs through the use of all those responsibilities I was talking about, particularly the one toward situations. Where are we? What are we doing? What's going on? What does it look like? All of those things are occurring through operations by which it's evident to everybody playing and anybody observing the scene is over or this new scene has begun. It's occurring. It's one of those things that has to occur for this kind of activity to be said to operate. So inside a given location and a given composition of characters or circumstances, all sorts of other sub-events, occurrences, in retrospect, plot happen. We have the imagined movement of characters. We have their interaction with one another. We have events. We have potential conflicts among them. There's all sorts of this stuff that we really often identify with tabletop role playing as such. Whether it's a big combat scene or situation, or whether it's a deadly serious negotiation, or whether it is the cresting of the winged ship over the mountain ridge and a whole new vista opens up to the characters. Any number of things like that, but there is movement, there's interaction, there are events, there are potential conflicts. One of the techniques of all fiction that I'm aware of is discontinuity in the proceeding of events. 10 days later, 5 minutes later. With time, it's real easy. We call it a hard cut or a jump cut or a time lapse or something like that. There's also the same thing in location. The character, some character says something like, so things should be pretty easy when we talk to the Duke then. And then wham, we see a hard cut and they're all hanging in chains in the Duke's dungeon. Something like that. It could be a lot less severe than that, obviously. Well, to the marketplace. And you know what? We're going to sort of soft focus blend into simply someone saying something to someone else. Glory be, in the marketplace. Positioning of characters, particularly those entities over which I, as an individual in play, may have some agency over, a certain sense of this part is what I do, is make this one go. Positioning of them is often a matter of some import. When I say positioning, we could be talking about social status, we could be talking about certain resources that they have available to them. I'm actually thinking more in terms of raw physicality, where they happen to be standing. Is this an area in which consequences are potential for these differing positions? In a game with, or in a fictional circumstance with a lot of combat, this kind of thing ends up being a little edgy. The reason I bring it up is because play simply has to occur with some orientation, what I said before, about these things. When that becomes cacophonous, when the orientation breaks down, when the, shall we say, accord over, well, now we're in a new situation, or that this situation has taken on this particular set of potential outcomes, when that occurs, there can become a lowered understanding, a lowered agreement, a lowered attentiveness, and even a lowered sense of commitment to our shared enjoyment, a lowered sense of engagement at the level of, well, let's all make this happen, and a lot more tension and nervousness about what might happen to me because my character isn't going to get in a position of advantage, or may be in a situation where they're about to get screwed. There's a lot of fear there about what might happen. And when this breakdown occurs and all of a sudden, wait, I was in the front. No, wait. Oh, hey, I'm above. I have, okay. Everybody starts kind of yelling, or everyone shuts down or something like that. I call that murky play. Play can become kind of murky at that point. And it's a clear indicator that all of those things I was talking about earlier, the way we do it about situation in particular, the way we say, how are we oriented, the concept of who organizes this or who's organizing at this time, when all of this breaks down and there is simultaneously a lack of trust, a lack of engagement, and a lack of procedure. Just how much of play is murky or can become murky is a matter of some interest. It is, if you will, a somewhat mini version of what I spoke about in part one about kind of zilchy play. But it's awfully, awfully unhappy and uncomfortable. So keep that in mind, that there is a cost to not doing what I'm talking about. All right, let's continue. Let's continue with a little bit about our characters in a circumstance and the circumstances, the phenomena of play, the events have gained a little momentum, and we know where characters are, and we know what they're talking about. We know the moods that they're in. We know the potential issues that may be of importance to us, fictionally speaking, that characters would like to take some action about. And all of this is occurring. Play is moving along. Now, one of the interesting difficulties about this is that it is really not all that fun for certainty to prevail at all times. It's not all that fun for me to say fully, okay, and then it goes like this, and then the next person says, oh, well, then I am now going to be speaking, and now I will have it go like this, and that occurs, and we just keep trading it around. I always like to talk about that in the sense of the conch from the novel The Lord of the Flies, where you have this seashell that the children are using initially to as a kind of a Robert's Rules of Order, the how do you speak or who gets to speak, and they pass the shell back and forth about that. Well, the problem with the conch in this tabletop activity, it's boring. To continue with my endless stream of metaphors, it's a little bit like playing ball with a wet rag. You could potentially play something like softball or any ball sport with a wet rag instead of a bouncy ball. And you simply toss it to each other. You do everything. Let's play basketball. We'll do everything we do with basketball, except instead of a ball, we'll use a wet rag. We can do it. We totally can do it. It's just not as much fun. There is a dynamism imparted due to the uncertainty, the reactive quality of the object that we're using, above and beyond the differing physicality, the capabilities and actions and decisions of the real people. I think that's a strong metaphor for what we're talking about. There needs to be a bouncy quality to the instrumentation that we have in play. If the instrumentation is nothing but recording what we say, that's not bouncy. If the instrumentation is limp, it doesn't rebound upon what we say, much like what we say rebounds upon what we say, and it has its own qualities of doing so, it's just not as fun. Historically, some kind of instrumentation with some kind of random feature has played a big role in tabletop role-playing design. And I maintain that that's a very, very strong category of this bouncy quality. There are others. Some games have generated ways to talk and what can be said when, that it injects a quality of bounce into what's happening that's pretty engaging too. And there are others. I don't really care which it is. The diversity of instrumentation is remarkable, but the principle underlying it is the bounciness and how much. No bounciness, boring. Too much bounciness for a given group or for a given way that they want to do this, that's possible. But the degree of bounciness does seem also to have a role in design. So the first thing we need to think about is, really in the thick of play, a fictional circumstance in which characters' order of action and what they choose to do and the capability of what will or won't happen, all of those things are going to have consequence. And with that in mind, you can see in many cases sort of snapping in among the group of, okay, now we're going to use a subset of the instrumentation. Whether that's fun or not is a matter of some concern. Is this the point where we slump and say, okay, well, let's get through this part so we can get back to what we were doing? Or is this a part where we actually are energized? Let's take a look at what needs to be handled. It is, fictionally speaking, clear that different characters are going to be launching into activities. Let's think of that as the initiation of a given character's. Let's think first about what the activity may be. Intention. Intention on the part of the fictional character. Second, let's think about the moment relative to everyone else in which that initiation occurs, when the intent becomes directed effort. Let's continue the execution of that effort, it landing, if you will. And then finally, its effect. What impact does it have on either its target or on anything else that it might be affecting? If that's happening for all the characters all at once, the question is, now, out of the fiction, procedurally, how do we organize this? What instrumentation do we use, and what references do we use, and how does it play out? The interesting thing is that a given technique of procedure can combine them. So, for example, one might state one's character's intention and launch into the initiation of it as a single spoken act on your part, but then there is an entirely different act involving the execution of the effect. And perhaps there's now a trade-off. You've got your initiation and intent going, and you've got this other person's initiation and intent going before we move into the execution. And does their execution come in before your execution or not? And when and how is all of this established to be occurring as opposed to not occurring? If I say I throw my axe at him, does that mean we have to suddenly dial back to the order in which the actions occur? So somebody faster might have gone before me, before my axe even left my hand? Or was the statement of I throw my axe at him outside of the dedicated procedure for such things? Is that going to establish that the axe is in the air and now we click into that mode? All of these things are potential sources of murk, but I want to focus on the remarkable diversity of parceling up intent, initiation, execution, and effect in raw mechanical terms. I'm sure there's lots of ways in which anyone listening to this is accustomed to doing it and says, oh, well, it's obvious you do it like this. That's great. Diversity. There are a remarkable number of ways to do it across the existing spectrum of existing games, but also of the games that have not yet been designed. All right, what kind of mechanics then do we turn to in resolving, for example, the effect of an action? What kind of mechanics do we turn to in terms of the success or failure of a given action as a subset of this happening, and also the scale and the impact of what occurs? What are the mechanics that we use? There are some which kick directly into dialogue and have a lot to do with that credibility about outcomes. If it's just up to this person to say, well, then that person says. Or there may be instrumentation that is consulted, often with a highly bouncy quality. And that's another way, sort of a luck-oriented aspect of all of this, often highly statistical. Your character has this much percentage-wise in favor of getting this done, as opposed to this much. There's also reference to relative values. You can say, well, this character has so much of this, and then so much of that can either be spent or even just referred to to help tell us what happens. All of these features can be mixed or matched or combined in stupendous ways. That's what we often tend to think of as game mechanics, but I focus on those as a subset of that intent, initiation, execution, and effect, and all of those as a subset of the general principle of if play doesn't bounce, it ain't no fun.